Good evening and welcome to the first of what we hope to be four candidate forums for Cayuga County and for the races that are occurring for the November 3rd elections. As many of you know, there's a lot of attention being paid right now to the presidential race as well as the congressional race, but we have some very important Senate and Assembly races up this year that are on the ballot for November 3rd. The college here is returning to its normal schedule of having candidates in to talk about the issues and also to do forums. But you'll notice we're changing things a little bit. Our normal plan today would have been having Jeremy Boyer, the executive editor of The Citizen, asking the questions. But we're in a COVID-19 pandemic world and things have changed a little bit. So for today, you're going to have me asking the questions, which is unusual, of the candidates who are here today. Mr. Boyer may be sending in some questions in a few minutes, but we are going to have the two candidates for the 130th Assembly District. This is a district that represents a large swath of Cayuga County, including Brutus, Cato, Conquest, Ira, Mentz, Sterling, and Victory. This is also a rematch of sorts with our two candidates today. Brian Manktelow is our current assemblyman who was elected 2 years ago, and he is running against Scott Comegys, who was his opponent 2 years ago. And so we're delighted to have you both in the studio, and as I say from the college that I've said I think 3 or 4 times before we started, we greatly appreciate you allowing us to experiment with your race as the first of 4 here. So we might have some technical glitches as we go along, but we apologize in advance, but thank you for your willingness to help our college and our college students here. So Assemblyman Manktelow is on the Republican, Conservative, and Independence lines, and Scott Comegys is on the Democratic and Serve America Movement Party. If you look at, we have it up as the SAM Party on the screen, but they are both here to talk about the issues that are before the district in the 130th. What they will be doing by a coin toss is making opening 2-minute opening remarks. They'll reverse that at the end, but in between we'll have questions and answers. We ask you to limit your comments to 2 minutes. As you know, we'll hold up a sign when you have 30 seconds, and we'll try to stop you and let you finish your statement at the end of 2 minutes. So gentlemen, welcome, and again we'll hear from Mr. Comegys first, who again is on the Democratic and Serve America Movement Party. Welcome back to the studio.
Thank you, and good evening. First, I'd like to thank the Cayuga Community College for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to speak to you directly. And thank you, Guy, for hosting it as well, and Jeffrey Boyer for the questions. My name is Scott Comegys. I am an alpaca farmer, a husband, a father, a business manager, a public servant, a community organizer, and an outdoor enthusiast. And as all of those things, it is my goal to enable the people of our communities to live with success as they define it, genuinely as themselves, with dignity and with prosperity. I think that we all share the same goal, or at least a goal similar to that, but I also think that we can agree that that is a difficult goal to attain when we perpetually live in times of great uncertainty. And this year has certainly added to that greatly. But also in those times that we come together, and we expect our government to come together, to collaborate, to form solutions, and to include our perspectives in those solutions and the work that is being done to move forward. It is my goal to make sure that we are increasing our voice in the New York State government and are more effective at producing those solutions and providing security in times of uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Comegys. We'll now hear from the incumbent, Brian Manktelow, who is the current assemblyman for the 130th District. He is on the Republican, Conservative, and Independence Party lines. Welcome back to the studio.
Thank you, Guy, and thank you for having us here. I want to thank the college for having us here as well. And 2020, what a year for New York, what a year for our United States of America and the world. As COVID-19 hits us, we continually are working through that, and it's totally put us into a tailspin. And you know, where do we go and how do we get there now? You know, as a husband, a father, a farmer, a veteran, a former town supervisor, a former county legislator, and now your New York State Assemblyman, I understand what it'll take to get us to where we need to go and how to get there. So much of our lives moving forward here in New York will be about money, how are we going to pay for everything, and also the safety of our families and the people that we serve. Navigating through this devastation is tough, but I've done that through as a farmer for many years, as a former town supervisor, working through the Village of Lions Dissolution as well, and also chairing the Wayne County Finance Committee for several years, and also working at the county level. So with all that experience and understanding and knowing what our people are facing in the district, my job now is to take that experience that I've learned over those many years, and including the last 2 years in the Assembly, and making sure that I keep bringing that to Albany, making sure I represent you down there, and making sure that we together as communities, as small municipalities and members of New York State, we bring this forward and make sure we get it done. So again, I want to thank you for allowing me to be here today, and I look forward to serving you as your New York State Assemblyman, and thank you again, Guy.
Thank you. So we'll go right straight into questions right now, and
Sure.
through the miracle of technology, Mr. Boyer's questions have arrived. So we'll start with his. I think there's no better question right now, as I see a face mask that you both had to wear in here, that we should talk about COVID-19.
Sure.
I think there's most likely been a saturation of discussion, but we need to know where you both stand on this. So if you could, and we'll start with the Assemblyman first, because we're going to reverse back and forth. How do you think the state has responded to the COVID-19 situation? What would you have done differently? How do you assess the response right now? And you'll have 2 minutes on that.
Okay, so right off the bat, when COVID-19 hit New York State, we met in Albany as Assembly members and senators, met with Dr. Zucker and kind of created a plan moving forward, including our senior citizens that were probably most liable or could get the disease faster than anybody else. At that point, the governor moved forward and made some tough decisions very early on. Did a great job moving our state forward as the COVID-19 hit and some of the things that we had to do. But after that point moving forward, it was very important that because of the size of New York State and the one size that fits all approach that we tend to do in New York State really didn't work. Downstate that had the COVID at a high rate versus some of the rural areas up north and to the far west, we probably could have did some things different there, moving out with a more regional approach, and also at the same time getting our local municipalities and the people that are have the boots on the ground back home and really know what's going on in their communities and in their counties, making sure they're part of that solution, along with the legislators, the assembly members, and the senators. And that part of the ball was dropped. So as we continue to move forward with COVID-19, dealing with it each and every day, we need to be very understanding that we are going to have an economical fallout, not just this year, but probably 2 or 3 years down the road. So we need to make sure as we move forward with COVID-19, we are going to continue to look at those options and those decisions that we need to make for our economy, for the well-being of our families and our children, and all of us in New York State. So I'm looking forward to getting back down to Albany, and I will, again, push the issues that are in our district, making sure in our rural areas that New York State, the governor's office, understand really what we're up against and what we can do to help him to make sure we do everything together. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Comegys, how has the state responded? What have they done right? What have they done wrong? The Assemblyman just gave out some of his priorities. What would your priorities be during the COVID situation?
I think that this is a terrible time to be living in, that we don't want to have to deal with crises like this, but we need a good emergency plan in place for when pandemics can occur here. I think the governor did a great job making those tough decisions to say, for the sake of public safety, we need to close down certain areas. I think that I would agree with the Assemblyman that there were different things that we could do throughout different areas of the state. But the consistent communication that came out of Albany was to be safe and for ways to keep us safe. And I think that was a good thing. You know, encouraging people to wear masks, encouraging people to be socially distant, to not gather in large groups until we had some kind of handle on what this virus could do and how it spreads. And that unfortunately has caused a great economic decline for us. The economic impact has been extreme, and we have many people who are very angry with that, who want the entire state to open so that they can live their lives normally again. I think that what we need to communicate on all levels and as a unified government is that we are in the midst of a crisis and we have to get through the crisis before we can open up everything. And we have to have a good plan for how that happens. And we need to manage the people that are affected most first, our senior citizens, disabled community, people that need our attention more than anybody else. See to their needs, make sure that they are safe, and then we can go further. Have a really good plan to move forward and open up. And the other message that really needs to be conveyed here is that we will get through this. We will recover. And we will be included in how we recover. The rural areas contribute a great deal, and it is our chance to really have a better impact in our New York State government as we recover.
Thank you. And I should say, if you would like to respond and follow up with a 30-second to a minute response, we'll allow those as well. But if not, I want to turn to a different part of this issue, and that is the Assembly and the Senate did agree to some emergency powers for the governor. They were agreed to in March. I believe there are quarterly reports that the governor is supposed to respond with, and then the Assembly and the Senate have, I think, 2 weeks or less to respond to that. A, should those emergency powers be extended, curbed, or changed? We'll start with Mr. Comegys.
They should be curbed. You know, the emergency powers are for in the moment. Right now we have an Assembly and a Senate that can work together, that can talk together and come up with better plans and work with the governor to not necessarily do everything exactly by executive order. We are all working for the benefit of all people. There are disturbing elements to what the governor was able to get as far as emergency powers. And I think it's important that we have more input from the people than we do from one person at the top. Okay.
Thank you. Assemblyman, on the issue of the powers that were given to the governor back in March, and you should state for the record whether you were supportive of those or not.
Yes, as many of us were. In the initial onset, not knowing exactly how COVID was going to affect New York State, making sure he had the ability to make things happen very quickly, especially as I noted earlier that one of the key topics when we were in Albany were our seniors and making sure they were a priority, making sure we had places for them to be safe and being out of harm's way as COVID-19 hit. And that's a perfect example where his powers absolutely should be curved or changed at this point. Absolutely. We've been pushing for that on both sides of the aisle, but we cannot get enough votes in Albany to make that happen. We've offered up legislation to do that. New York State is very big and very vast, and our regions, as I said earlier, are totally different from one another, and we need to work together. And speaking with members of the majority and the minority on both sides wanting the governor to do that. We need to do that, and we need to be accountable for some of the mistakes that were made so we can continue to move forward. I do think that we as Assembly members and senators and the people that we represent need that representation, and the way it is now, the governor is not allowing that.
Okay. Thank you. Well, let's talk about money, because that's one of the pieces here. So I know Mr. Boyer gave me a number of numbers, but I'm going to deal with the simple numbers that I know. It's said that at the start of the fiscal year on April 1st, which was about 2 weeks into the major part of COVID-19, the state had a $14.5 billion with a B hole in its budget. We are now past the halfway mark of the year. I'm not sure that the state has taken any steps other than we've heard talk about proposed cuts, retainages, other topics like that. Could you tell us, Assemblyman, we'll start with you and then go to Mr. Comegys, how would you like to deal with that, what I'm assuming is a much larger gap now because many of those businesses have not returned? And we'll give you 2 minutes on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that we as a state need to identify is truly where we are at as far as debt. Until we have that number or a really good educated guess of where we're at, I don't know how we as a state can move forward. We need to look at the previous debt going into the budget, the debt that we have now, and also at the same time bringing our local governments into play here because they know what's going on back home. They know what's happening with the people they represent within the counties and the towns and the villages. We need to know those numbers, just like numbers that we've dealt with for the nursing home numbers and the deaths there. We need to know those numbers to find out what that debt is. Once we have that debt number, then we can start looking long term. It's not going to be a one-year fix. We're going to be dealing with this for many years. Much like my farm business, understanding how to deal with that, understanding how to make that work for the next several years just to survive. And we need to do that as a state. And that's on the governor's shoulders right now. We're asking for those numbers. We want to know those numbers, and we want to know them so we can act as good government for the people that we represent. It's not only us that's hurting at the government level. It's our single-family parents, our homes, our schools, our municipalities, our hospitals. We're all hurting. We're all tough shape. Landlords that have not been paid rent for several months and cannot do anything about it. There was no money ever allocated for our landlords. How are we going to deal with all this? It's not just at the state level. It's at our country level, at our state, and at our local levels. So we need to be down there, and the governor needs to come out and tell us where we're at this day, at this point in time, where the debt is for New York State, and how are we going to be able to move out of that, or at least give us his suggestion so we can react to that. I know what the people that I represent want. I know where they want to go, so we need to make that happen, but the governor's got to come clean on that debt to the best of his ability. Thank you.
Mr. Comegys, the same question in regards to the $14.5 or more billion dollar shortfall?
Certainly. Well, I mean, even before that, let's look at the original budget, and we were already looking at a $6 billion gap that needed to be covered. And then we increased that into the 14.5 or beyond $1 billion that gap that the state budget could not come up with. And we have to look beyond just those numbers. We have to look at what we are willing to do to make sure that we can cover that gap to begin with. And we have at least 6 good proposals for raising revenue on people that have actually asked us as well. Raise taxes on those who are very wealthy. That is one of the measures that we need to do. Now, certainly we also need to look at the rest of the budget and make sure that we are being as efficient as possible so that we can provide the services that we are expected of our state. And yes, we have to look at the long-term goals of how are we going to be able to do this sustainably? Are we going to be able to sustainably raise revenues to a level that we can provide service and not go further into debt? Because I also agree, we need to get that debt worked down significantly. That is the major priority for the Assembly, for the Senate this year. We're going to have to deal with how are we going to deal with this hole in our budget, and are we going to be able to make the tough choices and listen to the people who have also been telling us that we have money, there is a way to equitably tax us and get the money distributed to all areas of the state so that the municipalities can provide the services they need, so that homes don't get taxed out of existence. Because as we know, if we cut more, those costs are going to go on to the homeowners and increase the property taxes. We don't want to do that anymore. So we need to do something different in order to fill this hole.
I'd like to really dive into this in 3 different ways, and let's start with this. So there does seem to be some hope. Obviously, we have a very large national campaign going on, and there's been a holdup on any more stimulus or COVID-19 aid from Washington. There is this thought that we should just wait until whether the ballots are, and I'll get to that later, ballots are counted on November 3rd, or you wait for the Electoral College, or you wait to see if it's going to be President Trump again or President Biden. Should we be waiting, and we'll start with Mr. Comegys, and I'll give these 1-minute responses. Should we be waiting on Washington for these answers and that timeline, or should we be making these decisions now?
We should be working on the problem right now. We have an obligation to the people to come up with a plan, and part of that plan may be going to the federal government and communicating our expectations there. But we need to have a plan working now. I believe that there are already meetings going on, or should be, about how we can get these services covered, how we can provide for the landlords that do need to be paid. Basically, we need to have a cognizant plan going into before our executive branch gets decided in November, because it's all happening now. If we're not working on it now, what are we doing?
Assemblyman, wait or move now?
Absolutely move now. There's no reason why we should not be moving forward. There's no reason why the governor should not be giving us those numbers so our finance committees in Albany can work on this. We don't know how the election is going to turn out. We don't know how much money the feds are going to have. We cannot wait for that. Just like as a farm owner, I couldn't wait for the insurance. I couldn't wait to see what kind of subsidies may come in to help. That you have to act now, just like we do at home with our families. We don't wait for something to come down the road. We have to act then. And we have that responsibility to New Yorkers. We have that responsibility to the people that we represent in our district here. And that's what needs to be done. And we need to be back in Albany, putting pressure on the governor to sit down with us and let's come up with a solution, at least a short-term solution to where we're going to go.
So let me follow up with, there are usually three ways that you can, and I'll start with you, Assemblyman, and then
Sure.
we'll go back, and then we've got one more budget one on after that. There's usually three ways you close a deficit. You can either raise taxes, cut things, or you can just borrow. So I really want to get into what your priorities, and we'll give you 2 minutes on this.
Okay.
What do you see your priorities are to solve what is most likely a larger than $14.5 billion deficit, and we're now halfway in through, so who knows what that number is.
Sure.
You also have to pass a budget less than 6 months from 2 weeks ago. So with that in mind.
You know, my concern about taxing anybody else, and I know some of the multi-billionaires and millionaires in New York State have said, yeah, go ahead and tax us some more. That's not the solution. We definitely have a spending problem in New York State. And if we're going to move forward, we cannot just continue to raise taxes, because here's what's going to happen. There's already such an migration of people that live in New York because it is too costly to live here. And we just went through this with school taxes, meeting with many senior citizens that probably are not going to stay here because they can't afford the taxes to stay in their home that's paid off for. So we absolutely cannot do that. We need to look at the way what services we want to provide. We need a robust economy to do so. And right now we don't have that robust economy, partly because of COVID, partly because of the situation we were in going into the $6.2 or $6.8 million or $1 billion deficit. That deficit was here. That was mismanagement on the governor for prior years. We did not need to do that. We continue to spend money like we spend every paycheck that New York State gets. We can't do that. We are responsible for the people that we represent, and we need to leave as much money in their pockets. So if we're going to do that, if we go ahead and overtax, you're going to see another out-migration of people leaving New York State, and we're going to have vacant places. We're already seeing that in New York City, where people are leaving New York City because, one, it's not safe, and secondly, they can't afford to live there anymore, especially in this situation. So I'm asking the governor, again, as we've had several times, let's roll our sleeves up and let's get to work and let's figure out how we're going to do this. So right now, we need to look at the priorities of the programs that we offer through New York State, and we're going to have to make some tough decisions. Which ones are we going to cut? Which ones can't we touch? And which ones may we need to take another look at moving forward? So those are my priorities. Let's sit down and look at everything that's on the table. Let's put it all out there and then make some tough decisions.
Mr. Comegys, on the issue, I know you mentioned one set of priorities early on, a couple of minutes ago. Could you flesh that out? Obviously,
Certainly.
Raising taxes, cutting programs, just going to debt.
Right. So, you know, this is, you're asking for a 2-minute response on a very complex issue. You know, and
I'll give you more time if we want to get into, we're going to get into specifics in a moment, but go ahead. I'm going to, and your clock starts now.
So, as I said before, we do have the ability to raise taxes on wealthier citizens, which actually would not affect many people in our area. There's actually only 115, 118 billionaires in New York State. And those are the people that would be affected by the raise in taxes. And in doing so, we actually may be able to affect, as we are looking at everything in the budget, a way to reduce property taxes for homeowners. So when we're looking at if the state pays for its obligations, when it mandates any particular program, we also need to make sure that the state has a plan to pay for it and not put that burden on the municipalities, you know, as an extra burden. That has been one of the classic problems for our state, in that we say, okay, you have to have X amount of programs for education, but we're not going to provide you all the money that will support those programs. So you're going to have to get that from your citizens, who are already taxed greatly for property taxes in in school taxes. But the state does have a $6 million rainy day fund, as it were. It needs to be able to cut into that as it needs to. It needs to be able to raise taxes on the wealthy so that we can support every family in the state. And then it needs to be more responsible with what it's mandating and have a plan for spending for everything that it does. These are, like, as I say, very complex issues, and it can take months of negotiation to get through everything. And we do need to look at absolutely every program, making sure that every program has a good impact for the entire community.
Did you have something you wanted to respond to?
Sure, just
and
back
I'll
to
give Mr. Comegys a minute as well.
Just back to the mandates and the taxing part. Because of New York State and the way we are, we need to start, again, taking a regional approach, because issues and the way they look at things in downstate, whether it's the city, Long Island, or any other area coming up through Albany, is definitely different here. And the one-size-fits-all taxation will not work. We need to be cognizant of how we're going to move that forward. So, yes, absolutely. But that's actually got to be driven by the governor. We can sit down and talk all we want, but until we get the governor on board with this, and we have many, many mandates already out there that have been promised, we can go on this forever, because how many millions and millions and millions of dollars are owed to the schools right now because of the funded mandates that were supposed to be funded by New York State that are not. Mm-hmm. And we need to change that. And that's not going to change overnight. We as legislators aren't going to change it. Sometimes that's got to be driven back by the schools. Thank you.
Mr. Comegys, you'll have a minute as well.
Yes, well, and while the governor has a great deal of power in that, it is also up to us as legislators to come together and really come to an agreement, a strong agreement, and make sure that we are, even though the process for the budgeting right now does not necessarily give the Assembly or the Senate co-equal budgeting powers, all the power really resides within the governor and his decisions, we have to have more of an influence on that. We have to be able to communicate to the governor the needs of the state, the needs of our people, and even in those regional differences that we have. That's why we're working together with people from downstate, from New York City, and making sure that they understand our needs as well as we understand their needs. This is the only way that we're going to come together as a state in order to solve our problems.
Thank you. So, before we started, because we were having some technical difficulties beforehand, as we were trying to get Mr. Boyer on, but we've got his questions here. We talked about schools and where your children all are, and here in Auburn, schools started up today in a sense of everybody's back in the classroom. So the big worry that almost everyone has had locally in school districts is the governor during the summer talked about a 20-20-20 cut or retainage, that you would have higher education, public schools, and then obviously in the area of healthcare that he might have to do if there was not stimulus money from Washington. So that being said, Mr. Boyer would like to know is, should school aid be on the table right now? Obviously 20% is on the table right now, but should it be on the table as a cut? And if that's the case, what do schools do? And if it isn't on the table, how do you make up that loss? And we'll start with Mr. Comegys.
I don't think we should be looking at schools or healthcare as far as cuts go. We are providing services to our children. We're providing education to our children. We're providing healthcare services that are in dire need, especially in the midst of a pandemic. If we're going to be cutting anything, we would have to look at other areas, other ways that the state can make up some revenue. But realistically, I don't think we should be looking at cutting services, cutting schools especially right now, because we've got too much uncertainty here. And what we're looking to provide is also some way of moving forward as we're going through the pandemic. I think cutting schools especially would be disastrous right now.
So Mr. Boyer would ask me to ask you as a follow-up for 30 seconds, where do you get the money from?
I'll be honest, I don't know. It's at that really weird place right now. I think we do need to look at different taxation. We do need to put pressure on the federal government to go ahead and help us out as well. I think that we all have relationships in that regard. I think that no matter who wins the election on November 3rd, we're going to have to be approaching the federal government and saying we have to provide for our people. And this is the way you do it.
Assemblyman, thank you. Assemblyman, this issue of is the 20% keep it on the table, and if you keep it on the table, how does the state help school districts, if at all? If you don't, where do you get the money from? And we'll give you the same 2.5, 3 minutes on that.
Well, I know that, you know, I agree that I don't know how we cut the schools. The schools are in chaos right now. They really don't know what the costs are going to be long term. You know, one day we're going to school, 3 days, 5 days, we're busing, we're not busing, how are we going to handle the food? And early on when we got some of our CARES money from the federal government, there was $1 billion that was supposed to go to the school, to all the schools. And then when we got the school runs for each school, every school in my district, the governor added a line to the school run saying there's a pandemic cost. So basically what the governor did was that $1 billion that we got from the federal government that were supposed to go to the schools, he cut the schools about that $1 billion, and at the same time we'll give you the $1 billion. So he gained $1 billion and the schools lost $1 billion. He gained $1 billion to help his cause with the deficit, but it actually hurt the schools. Where do you cut? You take another hard look at spending, and that's why we as legislators should be in session talking about this across the aisles. You know, let's take another hard look at what services are absolutely necessary and what services can we slow down for several years. Can we take another look? And also, let's look at the spending that the state's done for many, many years as far as putting dollars here and putting dollars here. Projects that has actually failed. Let's take a hard look at that and say, look, we're not going to do that right now. We need to take care of our schools and our children and those families. So that's one way that we could take another hard look. And also, what mandates that the schools are having to do right now could we get rid of and not hurt anybody? There are some out there that we could do. That's what we really need to take a hard look at.
Mr. Comegys, you'll have 30 seconds.
Yeah, and in adding, looking at that, looking at those programs, looking at projects like infrastructure projects and things like that, I would say a lot of the economic stimulus money that was basically used as a contest throughout the state, a lot of that money needs to be reevaluated and say maybe we should look at our economic stimulus and put that into schools or healthcare or infrastructure, and that would be a wiser way of looking at things.
Just because we're not the acronym place, you're talking about Regional Economic Development Council money? Okay.
Yes.
So we're continuing on. I just want to let people know what they're watching, if we could for a second. So we're watching the candidates for the 130th Assembly District. This is a district that we have two assemblymen in Cayuga County, Gary D. Finch, who represents half of Cayuga County and all of the city of Auburn. We'll have the forum for his district at the end of the month. But right now we have the candidates for the 130th, which includes the towns of Brutus, Cato, Conquest, Ira, Mentz, Sterling, and Victory. We have Assemblyman Brian Manktelow, who is the current incumbent there. He is on the Republican, Conservative, and Independence Party lines. He is being challenged again, as occurred 2 years ago, by Scott Comegys, who's on the Democratic and Serve America Movement Party. We want to, again, thank you. Just some notes. Jeremy Boyer, the executive editor of The Citizen, has sent us the questions because we're having some technical difficulties. I am the timekeeper, which is unusual for our forums. And occasionally, if you see our candidates looking to the side of a camera, we apologize. They're getting waved off that it's 30 seconds to go. They have 30 seconds to go for their answers. So, welcome, gentlemen, again.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to switch gears, if I could, to a couple of policy issues that Mr. Boyer had asked. So, let's talk about one that is near and dear to the people of northern Cayuga County, and that's the flooding that has occurred along the lake area. Can you evaluate the state's response to flooding issues along Lake Ontario shoreline? What would you like to see done at a state level? And I think we started with Mr. Comegys on the last question, so this will be Assemblyman Manktelow. You have 2 minutes on this issue.
Thank you, Guy. I'm very fortunate to be on the chair of the task force for the Minority Conference in regards to the flooding on Lake Ontario, especially in Cayuga County, Oswego and Wayne counties, all within the district. The state is reacting, just not fast enough. Some of the things that we met with in the governor's Red Room in Albany, talking about how we can expedite things for the individuals that are having the problems. And he said we would do things with DEC to make that happen. We're going to continue to push that. The ready money funding that was provided by the governor and by New York State, did a huge amount of work for the area, but at the same time, it's not enough. As we met with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers last week, we'll be having them coming out to take a look too, because they can also look at what they can do from the federal side also. And we're going to continue to push that. And one of the sad things is, back when I was a town supervisor in Wayne County, we addressed this with the governor's office that, look, if Plan 2014 goes into effect, this is exactly what's going to happen. And when that was put into effect, that's exactly what happened. We knew that. The governor could have stepped up to the plate and probably pushed the federal government a little harder to negotiate, and I wish that had been done. But that's not here nor there. We're going to continue to push and work with the IJC to look at that, to look at the flooding situation. And I already know that the Great Lakes out to the west side, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, they're well above flood level out there in a lot of those areas as well. We all know that that water's coming to Lake Ontario. So I'll be meeting with some of the people from the IJC next week, making sure that we're going to push as much water out as we possibly can, making sure we're going to do the best possible thing we can for the residents along the shore, moving into the winter season and the ending of the shipping season on Lake Ontario.
Thank you. Mr. Comegys, the state's response on flooding up in northern Cuyahoga County and along the lake?
The state is constantly reacting to things that are occurring. We have climate disruption that is adding to a situation, and you know, some of them brought up a plan to 2014, which I actually think, you know, when they made that plan, they had the best of intentions, but they had the worst of implementation when it comes down to it. They needed to be able to react better when they needed to change that plan. They needed to listen to the residents when they were complaining about the possible flooding, and with the climate disruption that also helped to push more water down into our lakes and on our shores. We needed to be prepared with better measures for resiliency. You know, whether that is extra seawalls or maybe, you know, opening up areas to accept more water into wetlands, which is basically what they're naturally supposed to be doing, and not just thinking about how we can push the water down further, but rather than constantly reacting to the next disaster. And I am fully expecting another flood next year, and I am fully expecting that we will hear from the residents and the farmers and everyone along the shore crying for help again, because we don't have a solid plan for where the water is going and how we're going to deal with the problem yet. I think that we need to be working more proactively with this and looking at better plans for how we're diverting the water, how we're using the water, how we can conserve the water. Okay. That's how I think where we need to focus on that.
Thank you. We'll move on to two law and order issues. Maybe it depends on your perspective. You consider them law and order, but Mr. Boyer asked that there have been recent changes, and this is to Mr. Comegys first, been recent changes in the cash bail system in New York. Changes went into effect to start the year by eliminating cash bail for most crimes, and the legislature, after concerns were raised about some of the dangerous offenders being released, amended the law to make some additional changes in bail eligibility. Is bail reform at the right stage now? And you have 2 minutes on this.
I think we're going to be talking about bail reform for a very long time, and it is going to be a constant refinement of that law. When the law was introduced, there were some things that I had some concerns with, although I, in generally, support the law, because I think that we need to get to a place in our justice system where we're being more equal and equitable with how we're dealing with people as they are being arrested or being accused of crimes. And the situation that we had were that some people would get accused of a crime, not be able to pay the bail, and would be incarcerated without any kind of conviction or trial yet. Whereas other people who may be accused of the same crime, if they had the money, could get out and continue on with their lives until their trial date. That is an injustice because it was harming people's lives, specifically poor people's lives. I think that everybody can agree that bail reform needed to happen. And I think that everybody can agree that for nonviolent crimes, eliminating cash bail is a good idea. One of the things that didn't necessarily happen, though, was that we didn't really revisit the penal code and look at what is defined as a violent crime to make sure that to make sure our classifications are correct. We also needed to look at our procedures for our law enforcement officials and make it very clear as to what they were looking at in enforcing these rules. I think where we're at right now is okay. We are still going to be refining it.
All right. Thank you, sir. Someone on the issue of cash bail, obviously some changes have been made. Is it enough? Are we in the right place when it comes to cash bail?
No, I think we overstepped our bounds, much like we do in Albany. We tend to pass bills before we vet them totally out. I think that when they were considering this piece of legislation, they should have brought all the players in, including the county justices, our judges, our police officers, all the local people that are going to be involved with this, as well as the court system, and as well as the finance part of it as well, because there's great changes now. Did it absolutely need to have some changes? Absolutely. Bail reform need to happen. But again, in Albany, we tend to make the big bounds, the big steps. And oh, by the way, we'll go back and fix it after we figure out what's wrong. Instead of, like I said, bringing the players to the table, let's discuss this before we make the law, before we make the major changes. And again, we tend to push too quickly. And again, issues in New York City where it's different than it is here, where you have the majority of the people, and there are different circumstances, and they did need to be different in that area compared to upstate New York and compared to rural America or rural New York State or even Long Island. Again, we need to really sometimes slow things down. Let's get all the players there, not afterwards, but before, so we can stop some of these issues. There have definitely been some issues with bail reform. There's been some deaths that probably wouldn't have happened if we had taken a look at bail reform prior to the major change. So that's kind of where I stand at it right now. I'm all for making some changes, and I just think we need to do it in a right way, and sometimes baby steps are better than the big lunge.
Thank you. Mr. Comegys, you'll have 1 minute to respond.
Sure, thank you. You know, all of those stakeholders that you mentioned were in the room. They have been talking about this for years, and it had been moving very slowly and getting nowhere, primarily because of opposition in the Senate prior. And they knew that. But these stakeholders, you know, people in the judicial areas, police officers, advocates for every section of this were in the room, and they crafted this piece of legislation, and they needed basically one more perspective. They needed our perspective, okay? And they didn't have it. Instead, we had it get passed without necessarily listening to us and without our input saying, hey, we can definitely do this, but we need to look at all the classifications, and we could have done it right now. And so my question really is, and I hate to put you on the spot, where were you with that? Why was that our perspective not put in there? Why were you not listened to?
Mr. Manktelow, you can answer that if you wish, or I'll move on.
Do I have a...
You have a minute, yes, absolutely.
Okay, I'd like to talk. So, as you said, the players were in the room. Where were the players from?
They were from all areas.
Okay, talking to the DAs that are in our district? Absolutely not. In any room, any questionnaire is brought out. And that's the issue. Sometimes because the city area have the majority of the votes, have the majority of the members, they do talk to their members and their people down there, but they don't talk to rural upstate or rural up north or Long Island. We are totally so different, and that's one of the biggest issues with New York State. It's totally different. It's a different world where we are compared to where they are. Things that work in New York City are fine, but they will not work in our rural areas or vice versa. So that's why I'm saying those players were not there. The DAs that I spoke to absolutely never were involved in that. So again, we'll keep making changes, and we'll be there, and we'll continue to fight for some of those changes.
Thank you. The next, and I consider this a law enforcement issue, but maybe not everybody will be. But Mr. Boreas, New York State has not yet legalized recreational marijuana use. Do you think we should take that step, and how should it be done? And I believe Assemblyman, you're up first on this one.
Well, we've looked at that in Albany, talking with many of the members and understanding their perspectives, talking to many of the citizens in the district, understanding their perspective as well. You know, everybody keeps talking about revenue. Yeah, there'll be some revenue there if we legalize it, but at the same time, there's going to be increased costs. There's going to be increased costs to our law enforcement. How are we going to handle somebody that's totally stoned driving a car down the road and he or she kills somebody? I've witnessed a person driving stoned. I know the laws aren't there. There's no way of enforcing anything. There's no test that I know of yet that we've brought into New York State. So again, now we're at a crossroads. We have a piece of legislation that could be moved forward. we could be getting money. Well, before we move it forward, let's put everything in place. Let's make sure we know. Let's make sure our law enforcement officers know exactly what they have to do if they pull somebody over. What's the parameters? How are we going to handle this? And really, what's the true cost? If you look at the stuff out in Colorado and you do your homework on the true cost, they're losing money because of all the court cases, all the other costs for the local PDs. I'm not for it. I'm not against it, but we really need to do our homework. And now the other thing I learned through COVID-19, anybody with a respiratory issue is more susceptible to COVID-19, just like the flu. So are we going to, again, jeopardize the people that we represent by allowing them to put that into their lungs, allowing them to be more susceptible to COVID-19 if they have lung issues? Those are some of the questions that I have, and I'd love to sit down and bring our people here and really do that and talk about what we need to do. We'll continue to do that. We'll continue to take a look at it. But right now, the way it is, I'm not going to put our law enforcement officers, again, in jeopardy of not knowing how to handle something when there's nothing to base it on.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Mr. Comegys, you'll have 2 minutes on this subject of legalization of recreational marijuana.
Thank you. The first thing I'll say, honestly, there are other priorities than the legalization of marijuana to worry about right now. We have a pandemic that we're going through. We have to recover from that. We've got a lot more to look at than simply legalizing marijuana and all of the issues that come in with it. And there are benefits, certainly. There are economic benefits, not only just for the state as far as revenue goes, but there is a new industry that can help to revitalize areas of the state, certainly. But there are health ramifications to look at. There are the legal ramifications. There are the law enforcement ramifications, as the Assemblyman has rightly pointed out. Although I would say that for a lot of those, I would think that the procedures would be similar to if they're dealing with somebody who's intoxicated. But they have to have the right way of testing, things like that. And there are costs that are involved with that. And we do need to know everything that goes into all of the different consequences that we court at the point that we say we're legalizing marijuana. But in general, I would say let's do the work to move it forward. I know that there are definite benefits to it, and I would support it. But right now, honestly, there are much higher priorities that we need to address.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on to 2 questions that Mr. Boyer came up for each of you. I guess I think Mr. Comegys is up first, so we'll start with him on this. And he writes, Assemblyman Manktelow more than doubled your vote total in the last election. Given this result, what do you say to voters about what's different this time that will change enough minds? And just so you know, since these are individually to you, you have 2 minutes. Your opponent, if they want to chime in, have 1 minute on this. So go ahead.
Well, the difference really is we have seen 2 years of how effective Mr. Manktelow has been. And nothing against you. I think you're a good person, and there's a lot of things that I think we agree on. But what I have seen has been a lot of opposition to a lot of the reforms being made, rather than necessarily finding ways that we can add our voice to the work being done. That I think that we have lacked our perspective in a lot of what happens in New York State for Albany, primarily because of all the opposition that has not just been Mr. Manktelow's doing, but has been for 30 years of our representation there. We have been the people who have said no to just about everything. Not everything, not absolutely everything, but just about everything. So all the major reforms we've said no to, rather than added our voices to see how we can actually make these things happen. That has been consistent for us, and as a result, we are being left behind. We are being left out of conversations. As Mr. Manktelow has already said, the governor has not listened to us. We have not been in the rooms. We've not been invited, because primarily we're the ones who are going to say no. Rather, I think that I can, and I don't even have to say it, I think I'm already making the relationships throughout the state, collaborations that will help us to succeed in our area, that will advance our perspective. Rural perspective is about neighbors helping each other to succeed. It's about communities coming together to achieve together what we can't achieve as individuals. Rural areas understand that we have to protect the land that is providing for us, and that we have to advocate for ourselves in the state and also communicate how much we are contributing. We are supposed to be making those collaborations, forming those good relationships so that we can get things passed for our area as well as the entire state. We haven't seen it yet. That is what I'm bringing to the table.
Assemblyman, you have 1 minute if you want to respond, or I'll go on. So your question, you will get 2 minutes on this, and Mr. Comegys will get 1 minute. Mr. Boyer writes, you signed on to a legal challenge to limit the state's compensation committee's attempt to put on outside income as part of the raise legislators got in 2019, taking them from $79,500 to $110,000. Explain your position on both outside income and whether you believe legislators should be getting more raises, as they are technically scheduled to go up to $130,000 next year, but core challenges may delay that. And you have 2 minutes on that.
Sure. Thanks, Guy. And I won't need the 2 minutes. It's pretty simple why I signed on to that. That piece of legislation that came through saying that if you're a member of the Assembly or the Senate, you cannot have an outside business that brings in more than, I believe it was $15,000. And I don't agree with that, because my belief is we should not have lifers in the Assembly or in the Senate. We should be there for terms. We should be there for X amount of years and then move on, because we become very complacent. We have lifers that have been there 20, 30, even 40 years, and their direction and their view never changes. We need to change that. So I don't know how somebody can run for the Assembly or the Senate that has a business, and let's say they're going to do it for 6 years. And oh, by the way, you can't have a business and bring 15 or gross more than $15,000. That's the main reason why I did that, because I totally believe that you should not be there for 20, 25 years. You should go down there, do your job, do it for X amount of years, and then move on and let somebody else come in. Do I agree with term limits? Absolutely. What that number is, I'm not sure yet, but between term limits and the way you get voted in and out, you can have term limits through your voting. So that's the major reason why I fought that, because I didn't agree with it. I had a farm business. I had a 4,000 acre field crop operation. I gave it up for this because I thought I'd have to. So we fought it, and I couldn't wait. So I don't agree with it.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Comegys, any comment on this? You have 1 minute if you do.
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay. So we have about 5 minutes left for just regular questions before we go out. So I want to do some 1 minute, real quick views from both of you. And I think Mr. Comegys will go first with you. Is voting safe in New York?
Yes. Voting is safe in New York because we have 3 different ways of doing it. You can do it absentee, you can do it early, or you can do it on Election Day. And if you're going to do it in person early or on Election Day, we have enough procedures in place to make sure that it is done safely, that it is done with respect, to make sure that nobody is going to contract COVID-19, hopefully. But if you are worried about COVID-19 and contracting it, you can vote absentee, which is absolutely safe.
Assemblyman, your thoughts on, is voting safe in New York?
Yeah, absolutely. Talking with the local board of elections in the district, knowing what they have in place, absolutely I agree with what Scott says, that we should be safe, and I'm fully supportive and understanding and feel pretty confident in that.
So let's stay on COVID-19 for just a second. Should there be in New York a mask mandate from Albany at this point? And you'll have 1 minute on that, Assemblyman.
Absolutely not. I don't know how you can do a mask mandate until you know exactly what it does and what it doesn't do. We don't know that answer. And is there going to be an exemption, a medical exemption? What about a senior citizen that can't breathe or is on oxygen? What about somebody that has asthma, such as myself? So I don't know how you can make it a mask mandate. I think with the education that we've done here in New York State through COVID-19, and I think majority of the people really do understand what we're up against. And what I see out in our district, I'm pretty proud. Our people that we represent in our district are doing the right thing. So no, at this time I cannot see a mask mandate.
Mr. Comegys, a mask mandate?
You know, I go back and forth on this because I think that we have people who are paying attention to what's being, the education pieces that are putting out there. And they're making those decisions for themselves and understanding that if they're wearing a mask, they are less likely to transmit or to breathe in anything that relates to COVID-19. Unfortunately, we also have a number of people that have been demonstrated throughout the nation that have known that they've had COVID-19, went to the public spaces, didn't follow the guidelines at all. and there was not recourse unless there was a mask mandate. I'm more in favor of a mask mandate at this point for public safety. You know, it's a really tough call, but I think primarily for public safety, there needs to be a mask mandate for public spaces.
Thank you. Last question, and this deals with the issue, and it kind of rolls up because the Assemblyman had the first question. You're going to have the last question before we go to closing statements. So in New York, there is not a mandate that everyone have the flu shot. And there's obviously going to be some calls about whether we're going to have a COVID vaccine whenever it comes out. Should, especially for public schools and public places, should there be a mandate that people get the flu shot and or COVID-19 vaccine? And you'll have 1 minute on this, Mr. Comegys.
Okay, so when it comes to mandating vaccines, again, you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis of what exactly we're talking about. So for COVID-19, if there's a vaccine, I would like to have the state truly encourage everybody to get that vaccine, but I'm also really cognizant of the fact that there are religious groups that are against vaccines, and through the First Amendment, they have the right to object that. And it's tough for me to say that any mandate should violate those rights that we have in our Bill of Rights. I think that the state can encourage the vaccines in any number of ways. I think that people will pay attention to the education pieces, that mandating the vaccines for public schools is probably something that should occur. You know, we want our kids to be safe. But if somebody objects and says, okay, for religious reasons or for other First Amendment reasons that they don't want to have the vaccine, that we also need to provide a plan for their kids to be served in our education system.
Thank you. Assemblyman, the issue of vaccines, especially breaking them out in regards to COVID and flu, and especially among school children.
Like many of the vaccines that we have, I do agree that it's definitely an option. I believe it's an option for the parents. I think that's something between the parents, the doctor, and the family. A parent knows their loved ones better than anyone else, and I cannot support mandating flu shots or COVID-19 at this time. I've seen too many reactions, talked to too many people that have had flu shots, that had reactions to the flu shot, and actually hurt the child and hurt the individual. So at this point, until somebody tells me in my district that I represent that we're all for it, all I've heard is no, it still should be the choice of the parent, and that's exactly what I'll support.
And just real quick,
yes.
I'll agree with you on that. And again, the way to really approach that, I think, is to make sure that everybody is educated as to the actual effects of every vaccine. You know, they're making an informed choice.
Thank you, gentlemen. So 55 minutes goes really quick. You may not think it, but I think it. So we're going to go with our 2-minute closings, and we're going to hear from the incumbent, Assemblyman Brian Manktelow, who is on the Republican, Conservative, and Independent lines.
Sure. So I'd like to address something that Scott had said to me just a little while ago. You know, we as politicians, when we run for office, we can talk the talk. We can absolutely talk the talk. We're all good at talking. We're perfect examples of we can sit here and talk about it. But it's about walking the walk. It's about doing what we're supposed to be doing. And you made reference earlier that, you know, I don't reach across the aisle. I'm not building those relationships. Well, let me give you a couple of examples of what just happened. So there's a company here in the district that deals with hemp. About a month ago, we got a call from the mayor of that community saying they're going to take their equipment and they're going to move it to Pennsylvania because it's too hard to do business in New York State. We can't get any answers from the Department of Health. At that time, I reached out to Donna Lepardo. She's the chairwoman for the Ag Committee on the majority side. At the same time, I reached out to Patrick Hooker. Pat, I knew for many years belonging in Farm Bureau and as a farmer, and said, look, Pat, this is what we're up against. In 2 days, because I had those relationships built, in 2 days we got that answer. We kept that multi-million-dollar business in our district, and they're up and running today, and our farmers are bringing their product to that business as we speak. So I can reach across the aisle. Secondly, in our small business committee down in Albany, we had a bill coming up that would be just devastating to small businesses. It was being pushed by the governor's office. Assemblywoman Cruz, who I sat across from in that committee meeting, her and I talked about it when the bill came forward. We were able to rally the troops on both sides of the aisle and stop that bill. So I have built those relationships. I do know how to work with them. And lastly, I'm going to run out of time, but about a month ago, we had 12 members of the majority come to a farm tour in the Catskills, again for the second time, bringing them through upstate in our area to see what it's about to grow and be a farmer in upstate New York. And it was great relationship building, just like the time when I went down to the city last summer to see their businesses, to see their housing issues and their rental issues. So I am building those. I've produced, and again, I'm asking for the support. I'd like to continue to work hard for you, and I think I'm doing a good job. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman, and thank you for your time today. We'll now hear from Scott Comegys. He is on the Democratic and Serve America Movement Party line. You have 2 minutes to make your closing statement as well.
Thank you. I think that we actually have a lot of the same goals as far as our communities go. We want to see our communities thrive. We want to see our individuals live successfully. I think we want to see each individual live genuinely as themselves. That unfortunately, over the years, we have sent too many messages that we are against everything else that New York State comes across, and that's not true. You yourself just proved it, that you have areas that you know that we have to work as a state together, and that you're willing to work some relationships. But over the years, we have not seen that, and I think that we are constantly being looked over as far as resources go, as far as input for legislation, because the idea is that Wayne, Cayuga, and Oswego County say no. And instead, we need to bring more people together and unite more people around the state. And this is what I've done my entire life. I bring people together. I form teams. We take impossible situations and we produce success out of that. I've done this at the University of Rochester. I've done this for movie theaters. I've done this for operations high and low. I've done this with my own farm that I made myself. It is time that we sent somebody else to the Assembly to advocate for this region, get the resources here, and really demonstrate how we can work with the state and so that the entire state can thrive. This is everything about my candidacy. This is everything to serve that goal so that every single one of us can live freely, genuinely, with respect and dignity and harmony and prosperity from our generation to the next generation and to generations beyond. That is our goal, and that's what I intend to work for.
Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for a couple of things. First of all, putting yourselves out there. We appreciate that. Running for office is no easy task. It most likely is not even easy or even conceivable for most people in a COVID-19 pandemic. We also want to thank you. You are our test case here for doing this. You all came in, followed safety protocols. You've got bands on your arms to make sure you've been checked and all that, and you're wearing masks. We appreciate you also allowing us to test this system out as we continue to do forums. We wish you well on the campaign trail. Be safe out there. We look forward to hearing from whoever wins in November or in the new year. We also want to thank Jeremy Boyer for his questions that were sent to us. We will hopefully have him in the studio, or at least online, on Tuesday when we come back for our other races, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. We want to also thank you, and thank you for listening over the last hour for the candidates for the 130th Assembly District. We'll be back on Thursday with a Beyond the Front Page, Inside Government, with Dana Balter, who is running for Congress in the 24th Congressional District. Our policy is that we send invitations out to all the candidates running, and if they respond and their opponents either do not respond or say no, we give them equal time. And as per our past practice, we had Senator Helming the other day. If a candidate accepts an invitation and their opponents either decline or don't respond, we give that person an equal time slot. So we'll be in the studio with Inside Government on Thursday with Dana Balter. Next Tuesday, on October 20th, are the candidates for the 51st Senate District Forum. That is Jim Barber, who's a Democrat, facing Peter Oberrocker, who's a Republican, to fill the seat created by the retirement of Senator James Seward, followed on Thursday, October 22nd, by the 50th Senate District Forum with John Mannion and Angie Renna. That is to fill the seat that was vacated earlier in the year by Senator Robert Antonacci and has been empty since January. On Tuesday, October 27th, will be our last forum. That'll be the 126th Assembly Forum. That will be for a seat that is being vacated by Gary D. Finch, who decided to seek reelection retirement earlier this year, and will be serving until January. But that will have Dia Carbajal, who's on the Democratic line, and John Lamatis, who's on the Republican line. Until Thursday for Community College, I want to thank you for watching and joining us for the 130th Assembly District Forum. I'm Guy Cosentino. We hope you're safe and healthy, and we'll see you back here in the studio on Thursday.